There are two reactions that are going to take place during the process of photosynthesis. The first reaction that would take place is a reaction known as the light reaction. And the light reaction takes place within the thylakoids. The second reaction that would take place is a reaction known as the Kelvin cycle. And the Kelvin cycle is going to take place in the fluid of the chloroplast known as the stroma. So as you can see, the process of photosynthesis takes place within the chloroplast, but at two different locations within the chloroplast. The light reaction takes place within the thylakoids, and then the Kelvin cycle takes place within the stroma. And the light reaction must take place first, and it has to go through before the Kelvin cycle can begin. So let's go ahead and start zooming in and talking about the light reaction and what are the reactants that are going to be needed and the products that will come out from the light reaction. So the light reaction takes place within the thylakoids. So if we go ahead and zoom in on one thylakoid, which is right here. Here is our thylakoid, and we've talked about how there are those chlorophyll pigments on the thylakoid. What happens is the light reaction, and the name says it all, light reaction, light is going to be absorbed. Which part is going to absorb that light? The chlorophyll pigments. So the chlorophyll pigments are going to absorb the light that's hitting those chlorophyll pigments. What else is going to be taken in the thylakoids? The water. So there are two reactants that the light reaction needs, light and water. What are the products that are going to come out? The products that are going to come out are the following. Oxygen is going to be released, and we know that oxygen eventually is going to be released out of the plant via the stomata, those tiny pores that we've discussed before. What else comes out from the light reaction? What are other products that come out? Some ATP, which is energy, and NADPH, which we will talk about in a few. If you remember, the process that we are talking about is known as photosynthesis. So if you break the words down, photosynthesis, you get photo, which means light. So photo is going to refer to the light reaction, and then synthesis is actually going to talk about the Kelvin cycle because that's when you synthesize and make glucose. So what are those NADPH? They're basically NADPH, it's a compound made up of phosphates and oxygens and nitrogens and hydrogens. So to simplify it, think of them as buckets. Again, that's just an analogy. Think of them as buckets, and those buckets are carrying electrons. And we all remember that electrons have a negative charge. So NADPH are basically buckets that their job is to carry a bunch of electrons. Now, if the bucket is empty, we refer to it as NADP positive. So NADP positive is basically the empty bucket, and NADPH, it's the filled up bucket, and it's filled up with a bunch of electrons. Now, why are those electrons important and why do we have to collect them? We will discuss that in just a few. But the process of gaining electrons is known as reduction. So if you have that empty bucket and it's getting filled up with a bunch of electrons, that reaction is called reduction. Now, if the electrons are basically dumped out of the bucket, so you go back to having an empty bucket, this process is known as oxidation. So as you can see, this reaction of reduction and oxidation, it's reversible. Reduction is gain and oxidation is loss. All what you're doing is you're gaining electrons or you're losing those electrons. Or you can think of it as you're gaining a bunch of hydrogens and you are losing also a bunch of hydrogens. So when you take a look at NADP positive, when it gains electrons in hydrogen, it becomes NADPH. When NADPH releases those electrons, it will go back to being NADP positive. So an easy way to remember that reduction is gain and oxidation is loss, we use that mnemonic oil rig. So oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. And the most important thing that we are gaining in this process of photosynthesis are a bunch of electrons. Now, back to the light reaction, we said that the light reaction takes place within the chloroplast, to be precise, within the thylakoids, and we said that light is going to hit those chlorophyll pigments. So light travels in a wave-like format and it's carrying those energy particles known as photons. So when the light hits those chlorophyll pigments, there's going to be a bunch of electrons right here. So there are a bunch of electrons within those chlorophyll molecules. What happens is those electrons, when they get hit with light, those electrons, they get super excited and they jump up. Now, when they jump up there, they're not going to be stable. And so those electrons, after they jump up and reach that excited state, they must come down. And so when they come down, they release heat and they release fluorescence light. So this process of the electrons jumping up and falling down, this is all happening during the light reaction within the thylakoids. But the process of the electrons jumping up and then going down, this process is known as the electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain takes place within the thylakoids. It's happening during the light reaction. And the electron transport chain, I don't want you to know too much detail about it. I just want you to know the basic idea that this is when the electrons are getting excited, they're jumping up, they're going down, and as they are going down, they are releasing heat, fluorescence light, and they are releasing energy. Now, where are all of these electrons coming from in the first place? So as we said, there are a bunch of electrons that are absorbing the light and they're getting excited. Well, where are those electrons coming from? Remember how we said the light reaction needs light and water? Water, how do we write water? Water is H2O. So water is made up of 2 hydrogen elements and 1 oxygen. What happens to water is that it breaks down. And so if you break down H2O, what are you going to get? Well, you're going to get a bunch of hydrogens and you're going to get a bunch of oxygens. And H2O, when you break it down, you're also going to get a bunch of electrons. And so these electrons, they're going to move up to the chlorophyll and they're going to absorb the light, they're going to get excited, they're going to start jumping up, coming down, and heat and energy is going to be released. Now, again, how is that going to take place? Let's go ahead and zoom in on this part right here. Notice how there is this enzyme right here known as ATP synthase. So during the electron transport chain, when the electrons are jumping up and going down, there's an enzyme known as ATP synthase, and that ATP synthase is going to start making ATP during that process when the electrons are jumping up and going down. Now, some of these electrons, when they are jumping up and going down, they're going to be captured by the NADP positive. Remember how I said NADP positive are like empty buckets? So as those electrons are falling down, some of those NADP positive will actually catch them, and it will become NADPH. Eventually, the products that come out from the light reaction, such as the ATP and the NADPH, they're both going to be used up by the Kelvin cycle. This image right here shows you an analogy of what's happening during that electron transport chain, which is again taking place during the light reaction. As we said, light, which is in the energy packets known as photons. It's going to hit those chlorophyll molecules, which are carrying electrons. And as we said, most of those electrons are coming from the water when it breaks down into hydrogens and oxygens and electrons. When those electrons absorb the light, woohoo, they get excited and they jump up. They can't stay up for forever, so they will come down. And as the electrons are coming down, what happens is they release a bunch of ATP. Think of them as they are, again, one more time analogy, they are coming down a hill, and the hill has that turbine, which you can think of the turbine as the ATP synthase. And so the more the electrons fall down, the turbine, which is that ATP synthase, spins really, really fast, releasing a bunch of ATP. And the process of the electrons getting excited, jumping up and going down is going to repeat. And as I said, some of those electrons, they are going to be captured by those empty buckets. Remember the empty buckets known as the NADP positive. And so when those buckets are going to be filled, we're going to refer to them as NADPH. So if we go ahead and summarize that first reaction that we've talked about, which is the light reaction, it takes place within the thylakoids. Two reactants are needed, the light and water. Water is going to break down into a bunch of hydrogens and oxygens and electrons. Those electrons are going to get excited because they're going to absorb that sunlight. When those electrons get excited, they jump up, and then as they're falling down, they are going to cause the release of ATP with the help of ATP synthase. Some of these electrons, as they're falling, they're going to be collected in those buckets. So now we're going to have those filled up buckets known as NADPH. And oxygen, which is going to be a byproduct, is going to be released via the stomata of the plants. So after the light reaction takes place and you get those three products, oxygen, which will be released out of the plant, ATP and NADPH, what's going to happen next is the Kelvin cycle. The Kelvin cycle is going to use the ATP and the NADPH, and it's also going to need some carbon dioxide from the air, which will come in through the stomata. The Kelvin cycle takes all of these three things, the carbon dioxide, the ATP, and the NADPH, and it's going to start making the main product that the plants want to make, and that is the sugar. So right here, the Kelvin cycle is going to take place within that thick fluid inside of the chloroplast known as the stroma. The Kelvin cycle needs three things. It needs carbon dioxide from the air, and it needs two products that come out from the light reaction. That's why the light reaction must take place before the Kelvin cycle. because the Calvin cycle needs ATP that comes out from the light reaction, and it needs all of these electrons that are going to be collected within the NADPH. The Calvin cycle takes all of these three things and it starts making the sugar. Now the Calvin cycle, as you can see, it's a pretty complicated process, but all I want you to know is where it takes place. So it takes place within the stroma of the chloroplast. I want you to know the three main reactants that that it needs, which is the carbon dioxide from the air, the ATP from the light reaction, and the bunch of electrons that are carried by the NADPH. Those three reactants, they will go ahead and react, and it's a bunch of steps that are going to take place, and then the main product that will come out is glucose. Now we said light travels in a wave-like format, and if we look at this electromagnetic spectrum, which is a wavelength of the visible light, we have all of the rainbow colors. As you can see, we've got the blues and the yellows and the oranges and the reds. The pigment mostly found in plants, it's the chlorophyll pigment, which is a green colored pigment. That green colored pigment, the reason why we are seeing it green, because the green light is going to be reflected, and then all of the other colors from that electromagnetic spectrum that you've looked at, it's going to basically, the chlorophyll pigment is going to absorb the blues and the violets and the reds and the yellow, and that's why the leaves are going to appear green for us. Now during the fall, the chlorophyll pigment starts to break down, and there's another pigment that's found in the chloroplast of the plants known as carotenoids, and that's why during the fall the leaves start turning reddish and yellowish in color, and that's because the carotenoid is reflecting the reds and the orange and the yellow, and it's actually absorbing the blues and the green. And so that's why during the fall, a lot of the plants are not, their leaves are not going to appear green anymore, because the green light is being absorbed. And the light that's being reflected is actually the red and the yellow light. So to summarize, the two reactions that take place for photosynthesis to occur are the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. The light reaction must take place first. One more time, it's called light because light is definitely needed. Calvin cycle does not need any light, and so another name they give Calvin cycle is light independent reaction, because it doesn't really need light, but it needs the products that comes out from the light reaction, which is the ATP and the NADPH. Light reaction is also going to release oxygen, and it's going to be released through the stomata. Calvin cycle takes the ATP, takes those electrons, and it's going to take also carbon dioxide from the air, and it's going to make the sugar. That's why photosynthesis, photo means light, and synthesis means the production of sugar. Now, what is the plant going to make with all of that sugar that it just made? The sugar that the plant is going to make, it's actually going to be used to go through the process known as cellular respiration. One more thing to mention is that once the Calvin cycle uses ATP, after Calvin cycle uses ATP, it will actually recycle it, and after it recycles it, it goes back to the light reaction. So ATP can actually keep getting recycled. Same thing with those filled up buckets. The NADPH, you're not going to throw away the buckets. You're just going to use those electrons, and then you get those empty buckets, which are the NADP positive, and they're going to be recycled one more time. They will go back to the light reaction to pick up more electrons. So as you can see, this is going to keep this process is going to keep repeating itself, and this is photosynthesis. Next time we will talk about cellular respiration. One more thing to mention right here, the concept of the glowing sticks, by the way, the idea behind those glowing sticks is kind of the idea of the electron transport chain. Inside of these glowing sticks that are chemicals, and there are electrons that will actually get excited, so usually um, to activate that glowing stick, you have to like break it. And so when you break it, those electrons in there will get excited and they jump up. And then as they're falling down, they're going to release fluorescence light, and that's why they would fluoresce. Eventually, after all the electrons get excited and they've all fallen down, the glowing stick is not going to be able to glow anymore.